It was raining the day I got the invitation. I remember the cold drizzle clinging to my jacket as I trudged back to my dorm after my last class. The campus, usually buzzing with life, was eerily quiet. The streetlights flickered against the gray sky, and wet leaves clung to the sidewalks like they were trying to stay hidden. My phone buzzed just as I reached the entrance to my building. Party tonight at Theta House. Be there. 9 p.m. Don't miss it. The text came from an unknown number. At first, I thought it was a mistake. I'd only been at this university for a couple of months and hadn't made enough friends to warrant an invitation to anything, let alone a fraternity party. But curiosity got the better of me. Theta House. I'd never heard of it before, which wasn't surprising since the campus was sprawling and full of hidden corners. I tossed my phone on my desk and stared at it for a while, debating whether or not to go. By the time I decided, it was already 8:30 p.m. I told myself it would be a good way to meet people, to shake off the loneliness that had been hanging over me like a second skin since the semester began. I threw on a hoodie and jeans, trying not to overthink it. The address was further from campus than I expected, tucked away on a tree-lined street I'd never ventured down before. The house was massive, an old Victorian relic with peeling paint and ivy creeping up its sides. It looked more like a haunted mansion than a frat house, but the muffled bass of music assured me I was in the right place. People lingered on the porch, laughing and talking, red Solo cups in hand. I hesitated on the sidewalk, questioning my decision. But before I could turn back, a girl with long blonde hair stumbled out the door, laughing as she grabbed my arm. "You made it," she said, her eyes glassy and unfocused. Before I could correct her, she tugged me inside. The air was thick with the smell of beer and sweat. The lights were dim, making it hard to tell who was who. I shuffled awkwardly through the crowd, feeling out of place but determined to stick it out. A guy handed me a drink, something bright red in a flimsy cup. He didn't say anything, just gave me a strange grin before disappearing back into the throng. I sipped it hesitantly. It tasted sweet and metallic, but I convinced myself it was just cheap booze. Time felt slippery after that. I don't remember much, just flashes. Laughter that didn't feel right, faces that seemed too close, voices murmuring words I couldn't understand. The next thing I knew, I was lying on my back in my dorm room, staring at the ceiling. My head pounded, and my mouth felt like it was full of cotton. For a moment, I thought it had all been a weird dream. But then I sat up and realized my door was locked, and there was someone else in the room. The first thing I noticed was the sound, slow, deliberate breathing that wasn't mine. My heart began to race as I turned my head toward the far corner of the room. At first, I thought it was a trick of the dim light coming from the street lamp outside. But no, there was definitely someone there. He was sitting in the chair by my desk, completely still, as if he had been waiting for me to wake up. His face was pale, almost gray, and his clothes looked worn, like they'd been slept in for days. He wasn't someone I recognized, not a classmate, not a neighbor from my floor. I froze, my mind scrambling for an explanation. Maybe he was drunk and wandered into the wrong room. Maybe it was some sort of cruel prank. But how did he get in? The door had been locked. The door had been locked. I knew I had locked it before heading out. "Who are you?" My voice came out hoarse, barely above a whisper. He didn't answer. His eyes were fixed on me, unblinking. There was something wrong about his gaze, something too intense, too calculated. It wasn't the look of a lost drunk or a confused stranger. It was something darker. I sat up slowly, trying not to panic. "You're in the wrong room," I said, louder this time, trying to sound firm. "You need to leave." Still, he didn't move. The breathing continued, steady, deliberate, almost too calm. I felt around blindly on my nightstand and grabbed the nearest object, a heavy book. My hands were trembling, but I gripped it tightly and stood up, trying to make myself seem larger than I felt. "I'm serious. Get out." Finally, he moved. Slowly, almost leisurely, he rose from the chair, his tall frame unfolding like a shadow stretching across the room. He didn't speak. He didn't blink. He just took one step toward me, and I stepped back instinctively, nearly tripping over the edge of my bed. "Stay back," I shouted, the book raised in my hand like a weapon. He stopped. His head tilted slightly, as if he were studying me, deciding something. Then, without a word, he turned and walked toward the door. I stood frozen as he reached for the handle, fully expecting him to find it locked. But somehow, impossibly, he opened it with ease and disappeared into the hallway. I rushed to the door, slamming it shut and locking it again. My hands were shaking so badly I could barely turn the key. My chest heaved as I tried to catch my breath, the flash my mind racing with questions. How had he gotten in? Why hadn't he said anything? And how had he unlocked the door from the inside when I knew I'd locked it before going to sleep? I leaned against the door, trying to steady myself. The room was silent again, but it didn't feel empty. His presence lingered, like a cold draft that wouldn't go away. I checked every corner, every shadow, but there was no sign of him. When I finally sat back on my bed, I noticed something I hadn't seen before. On my desk, where my notebook had been, there was a piece of paper folded neatly in half. My heart sank as I picked it up, the paper crinkling in my trembling hands. Written in uneven, shaky letters were the words, "This isn't over." I dropped the note as if it burned me and backed away, my breath coming in shallow gasps. My mind raced through the possibilities. Was this someone from the party? Did they follow me back? But none of it made sense. My memories of the night were fragmented, and the harder I tried to piece them together, the more my head throbbed. I didn't sleep for the rest of the night. Every noise in the hallway, every creak of the building settling made my pulse spike. I kept the lights on, clutching my phone, ready to call for help at the slightest hint of movement, but nothing happened. Morning came slowly, the pale light creeping through my blinds. I thought daylight would bring clarity, maybe even a sense of relief. Instead, it brought a growing sense of dread, because deep down I knew the note was right. This wasn't over. Days turned into weeks, but the sense of unease never left. I tried to bury myself in the routine of classes, assignments, and campus life, pretending that everything was fine. Yet no matter how much I tried to forget that night, the fear clung to me like a second skin. I couldn't concentrate, couldn't sleep. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw his face, those lifeless eyes, that eerie stillness. I told myself it was over. He was gone. But the truth kept gnawing at the edges of my mind. The note had promised more, and I couldn't shake the feeling that it was only a matter of time before something else happened. It started with small things. My desk drawers would be slightly ajar when I knew I'd closed them. My belongings, pens, notebooks, even my toothbrush, would shift positions as if someone had moved them. Once, I came back from class to find my bed neatly made, a detail that might have been comforting if I hadn't left it unmade that morning. I reported it to campus security, but they dismissed it as pranks. "It's a dorm," they said with a shrug. "Things like this happen. Maybe your roommate has a sense of humor." But I didn't have a roommate, and this wasn't funny. The final straw came one night when I woke to find the window in my room wide open, the curtains billowing in the cold night air. I knew, without a doubt, that I had locked it before going to bed. I stood there, staring at the window, paralyzed by the thought that someone had been in my room while I slept. I couldn't live like this. I decided to leave. It wasn't just the room or the dorm, it was the campus itself. Something about this place felt wrong, as if whatever had happened that night at the fraternity was still watching me, waiting for the right moment to strike again. As I packed, I found something tucked under my pillow. Another note. This one was shorter, just a single word, soon. I left the next morning without looking back, transferring to a different university halfway across the country. I thought I could escape whatever it was that had followed me, but even there, the nightmares persisted. I'd wake up drenched in sweat, convinced that he was in the room, watching me. Months later, I got an email from someone I didn't recognize. The subject line simply read, "Theta House." My heart sank as I opened it. The message was brief. "Are you still having the dreams? He visits me now too." There was no name, no way to respond. Just an attachment. A photo of the same note I'd found on my desk that first night. This isn't over. I deleted the email and changed my address. But deep down, I knew it wouldn't matter. Whatever had started that night wasn't tied to a place, it was tied to me. Even now, years later, I still feel it sometimes. The weight of his gaze, the faint sound of breathing that doesn't belong to me. I don't go to parties anymore. I don't let strangers get too close. But none of it really helps. The truth is, no matter how far I run or how much I try to move on, I know he's still out there, waiting. And one day I'm afraid he'll come back, to finish what he started. The air was electric that night. The Timberwolves had just pulled off a stunning victory, and the entire town seemed to be buzzing with pride. The small diner near campus, usually quiet and half-empty, had turned into an impromptu gathering spot, with fans in blue and white jerseys spilling out onto the sidewalks. Even I couldn't help but feel a sense of accomplishment. We'd worked hard for that win, but the celebration felt bigger than the game itself. It felt like a release, as if the whole town had been holding its breath for weeks. I stood outside the diner, rubbing my hands together for warmth while watching the snowflakes drift lazily under the glow of a street lamp. Winter had come early, and the chill bit through my jacket. I could hear Jake's unmistakable laugh from inside, loud and boisterous, cutting through the din of clinking glasses and cheers. He always had a way of making himself the center of attention, a magnetic energy that drew people in. Tyler was right beside him, as always, grinning like they just won the Stanley Cup. "Ethan," Jake's voice boomed as he leaned out the door, his face flushed with excitement and probably a few beers. "Come on, man, stop freezing your ass off out there. We're heading to my place. Big party. Everyone's coming." I hesitated. I'd never been much for parties, especially the kind Jake threw. They were loud, chaotic, and always seemed to teeter on the edge of getting out of hand. But I could feel the pull of the team, the camaraderie that came from sharing this moment. And honestly, part of me didn't want to be the odd one out again. "Yeah, all right," I said, pulling my hood up against the cold. "But I'm not staying late." Jake laughed, clapping me on the back as we walked toward Tyler's van. "You always say that. Tonight, you're cutting loose. No excuses." The drive to Jake's house was short, the van packed with teammates and their girlfriends. The energy was contagious. Everyone talking over each other, recounting plays from the game. Jake cranked up the music, drowning out the hum of the engine, and I couldn't help but laugh as Tyler tried to harmonize with the radio. It was stupid and loud and exactly what we all needed after the stress of the season. Jake's house was lit up like a beacon when we arrived, strings of holiday lights casting a warm glow against the snow-covered yard. Inside, the music was already blaring, and the smell of cheap beer and pizza hit me like a wall. I grabbed a soda from the kitchen, avoiding the keg that Jake and Tyler were proudly guarding like a pair of sentries. The party was in full swing within minutes. People I barely recognized from class or around town filled the house, cramming into the living room and spilling out onto the back porch. Jake was in his element, leading chants and toasts, basking in the glow of our victory. Tyler was right there with him, pouring drinks and cracking jokes that had everyone in stitches. I tried to relax, leaning against the kitchen counter and watching the chaos unfold. But something felt off. Maybe it was the snowstorm brewing outside, the wind picking up and rattling the windows, or maybe it was the gnawing sense of unease that had been with me all night, a feeling I couldn't quite shake. I glanced at the clock. It was nearly midnight, and the party showed no signs of slowing down. I told myself I'd leave soon, that I'd just wait for a break in the weather. But when Jake and Tyler burst into their faces lit up with mischief, I knew that wasn't going to happen. "Ethan," Jake shouted, grabbing my arm. "We're heading out. There's another party at Steph's place. It's gonna be epic. Let's go." "Jake, come on," I said, shaking my head. "The roads are crap. You've been drinking. Just stay here. This is already a great party." But Jake wasn't listening. He never did. Tyler was already grabbing his keys, laughing as he stumbled toward the door. "Don't be such a buzzkill, Ethan. It's just a few miles." I wanted to argue, to make them see how stupid it was, but the noise and the laughter and the energy of the night drowned out my voice. Before I knew it, we were piling back into the van, the headlights cutting through the swirling snow as Tyler pulled out of the driveway. The van was filled with the kind of reckless energy that only comes from a mix of adrenaline and alcohol. Jake was sitting shotgun, his phone glowing as he scrolled through songs, declaring himself the DJ for the ride. Tyler was behind the wheel, grinning as he revved the engine for no reason other than to hear the noise. In the back seat, our friends cheered and laughed, their voices louder than the music blasting through the speakers. I sat in the middle, gripping the seatbelt across my chest. The snowstorm outside was intensifying, turning the road ahead into a blur of white. The windshield wipers struggled to keep up, the rhythmic scraping sound adding to my growing sense of dread. I wanted to say something, to tell Tyler to slow down or to pull over, but I knew it wouldn't go over well. Jake would just laugh and call me paranoid. Tyler would roll his eyes and hit the gas just to prove a point. "You good, Ethan?" Jake asked, glancing back at me with a smirk. He had that carefree look in his eyes, the kind that made it impossible to reason with him. "You look like you've seen a ghost." "Yeah, I'm fine," I muttered, though my hands were clenched so tight my knuckles were white. "Just keep your eyes on the road." Jake laughed and turned up the music, the bass shaking the van. Tyler swerved slightly, and the van's tires skidded for a moment before finding traction again. The movement jolted everyone, but instead of concern, it only brought more laughter. "You're gonna get us killed," I said, louder this time. My voice was lost in the chaos. The road ahead curved sharply, disappearing into the forest. I could barely see where the asphalt ended and the ditch began. Tyler didn't slow down. If anything, he seemed to be speeding up, his grin widening as the van fishtailed slightly. "Tyler, slow down," I shouted, panic rising in my chest. "You're going to lose control." "Relax, man," Tyler said, his tone light but dismissive. "I've got this." But he didn't. The moment the van hit the curve, I knew we were in trouble. The tires slid on the icy road and Tyler jerked the wheel to correct it. The back end swung out, and for a second everything seemed to hang in the air. The laughter stopped. The music was drowned out by the sound of screeching tires and the metallic crunch of impact as the van slammed into a tree. The force of the crash threw me forward, my head slamming against the dashboard before snapping back. Everything went black for a moment, the world spinning and shifting as I tried to make sense of what had just happened. My ears were ringing, and when I opened my eyes, all I could see was shattered glass and crumpled metal. "Jake?" I croaked, my voice barely audible over the ringing in my head. I twisted in my seat, pain shooting through my body as I tried to turn around. "Tyler, is everyone okay?" There was no response. The van was eerily quiet, except for the faint sound of snow falling outside and the hiss of steam escaping from the engine. My heart pounded in my chest as I reached out, shaking Jake's shoulder. His head lolled to the side, his face pale and unmoving. "Jake," I shouted, my voice cracking. "Wake up!" Tyler was slumped over the steering wheel, blood dripping from a gash on his forehead. In the back seat, the others were motionless, their bodies twisted at unnatural angles. My stomach turned as I realized the full weight of what had just happened. The cold seeped into the van, biting at my skin as I fumbled for my phone, my hands trembling. The screen was cracked, but I managed to dial 911, my voice shaking as I gave them our location. The operator's calm voice was the only thing anchoring me to reality as I stared at the wreckage around me. Help was on the way, but I couldn't shake the feeling that it was already too late for some of us. The sirens came first, cutting through the stillness of the snowy night. Their piercing wails grew louder as the flashing lights illuminated the wreckage around me. I sat in the crushed van, too numb to move. The cold air bit at my face, but it didn't matter. I couldn't feel much of anything beyond the pounding in my head and the weight in my chest. Paramedics swarmed the scene, pulling me and the others from the wreckage. I remember their voices, calm but urgent, asking questions I could barely process. "Can you move your legs? Are you in pain? What's your name?" I mumbled answers, my mind stuck on the faces of my friends. Jake and Tyler were gone. I knew it even before the paramedics confirmed it. Their lifeless forms were covered with blankets, but I couldn't tear my eyes away. They were right there, but they felt a million miles away. I was loaded into an ambulance with two of the others who'd survived. Both of them were in rough shape, broken bones, deep cuts, but alive. I couldn't say the same for Jake and Tyler, and the guilt hit me harder than the crash had. I'd known it was a bad idea to get in that van. I should have stopped them. I should have done more. The hospital was a blur of bright lights and distant voices. Nurses and doctors hovered over me, cleaning my wounds and running tests. They said I was lucky. Minor injuries compared to the others. But I didn't feel lucky. I felt hollow. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw the crash. Jake laughing, Tyler gripping the wheel, the flash of white as we spun out of control. When my parents arrived, their relief was palpable. My mom hugged me tightly, her tears soaking into my hospital gown. My dad, usually stoic, had a haunted look in his eyes. They didn't say much. What could they say? But their presence was enough to keep me grounded. The next few days were a haze of painkillers and police interviews. They wanted details. How much had Tyler been drinking? Who had decided to drive? I answered their questions as best I could, but each one felt like a knife twisting in my gut. The weight of what had happened settled heavily on me. This wasn't just an accident. It was a series of bad decisions, and we all played a part. At Jake and Tyler's memorials, I saw their families. Jake's mom was inconsolable, her sobs echoing in the small church. Tyler's younger sister clung to her father's side, her tear-streaked face a reminder of the life that had been ripped away too soon. I couldn't bring myself to speak to them. What could I possibly say? Sorry wouldn't bring them back. In the weeks that followed, the surviving group of us struggled to find a way forward. We met one night in a quiet corner of the hospital, all still wearing the scars of that night. No one knew what to say at first, the silence stretching painfully between us. Finally, I spoke. "We can't let this happen again," I said, my voice shaky but firm. "We owe it to Jake and Tyler to do better. We can't drink and drive. Ever." The others nodded, their faces solemn. We made a pact that night. No more drinking and driving, no more reckless decisions. It felt small, insignificant in the face of what we'd lost, but it was something. A step forward. We decided to turn our pain into purpose. Together, we started a campaign at our school to raise awareness about the dangers of drunk driving. We spoke at assemblies, sharing our story in the hopes that it might prevent someone else from making the same mistakes. It wasn't easy, reliving that night over and over again, but it felt like the right thing to do. Even now, years later, the memories of that night haunt me. I still see Jake's grin and Tyler's confident laugh, frozen in time. I visit the curve where it happened sometimes, standing by the crosses we placed for them. The snow covers the road, erasing the skid marks, but I can still see them in my mind. I'll never forget them. I'll never stop wishing I had done more. But I'll also never stop trying to honor them, to make sure their story changes someone else's life for the better. The sun was setting behind the dense trees that surrounded Lakewood Camp, painting the sky in shades of orange and purple. I sat on a wooden bench near the main lodge, watching the ripples on the lake catch the fading light. The air was cool, but carried the faint smell of smoke from the bonfire being prepared in the center of the campgrounds. This was supposed to be a weekend to unwind, to forget about the pressures of college and the weight of deadlines. I'd agreed to come because Alex wanted me to. He always had a way of convincing me. At first, I thought this trip might actually be fun. The rustic cabins, the quiet lake, and the laughter of others drifting through the trees created an almost idyllic atmosphere. Alex and I had arrived with his friends from his soccer team, a group I barely knew, but had tried to make polite conversation with. They were lively and outgoing, the kind of people who filled every silence with jokes or teasing. It was easy to feel invisible around them, though Alex always made sure to pull me back into the fold, his arm draped casually over my shoulder as if to mark his territory. "Hey, Emily," he said earlier that day, nudging me with a playful grin. "You're too quiet. Relax a little, okay? We're here to have fun." I nodded, smiling faintly, though something about his tone made my stomach tighten. It wasn't the first time he'd said something like that, but here, surrounded by his friends, it felt different, dismissive, as if my silence was a problem he needed to fix. I shook the thought away, blaming my overthinking. Now, as I sat alone, I watched Alex and his friends by the fire. He was laughing, his voice louder than anyone else's, gesturing animatedly as he recounted some story. Every now and then, he'd glance over at me, flashing a smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. I felt a strange pang of unease. It wasn't the first time I'd felt it that weekend. It was subtle, like a splinter just beneath the skin, easy to ignore but impossible to forget entirely. As the evening wore on, the campgrounds grew darker. Lanterns flickered on the wooden posts lining the dirt paths, and the stars began to peek through the canopy above. Everyone had gathered around the bonfire now, toasting marshmallows and trading stories. I joined them reluctantly, taking a seat on the edge of the circle. Alex sat beside me, his arm brushing against mine as he handed me a stick and a marshmallow. "You having fun yet?" he asked, his tone light but insistent. "Yeah," I lied, forcing a smile. The truth was, I felt out of place. His friends were friendly enough, but their bond with Alex made me feel like an outsider. And Alex, he seemed different here. Sharper, more intense. As the night deepened, the stories turned into songs, and the laughter grew louder. It should have been comforting, but the unease inside me only grew. Alex leaned closer, his voice low in my ear. "Let's go for a walk," he said, his hand resting on my arm. I hesitated, glancing around the fire. "Can't we stay here?" "Come on," he said, his grip tightening slightly. "It'll be nice." Just the two of us. Something about the way he said it made me feel like I couldn't say no. My stomach churned, but I nodded. He stood, pulling me up with him. As we walked away from the firelight, the laughter and music faded, replaced by the crunch of leaves underfoot and the rustle of branches in the wind. The air grew colder as we ventured deeper into the woods, the warm glow of the bonfire fading behind us. The only sounds were our footsteps and the occasional rustle of leaves, but even those felt unnaturally loud in the quiet. I wrapped my arms around myself, wishing I'd brought my jacket. The further we went, the heavier my chest felt, like I was walking into something I couldn't name. Alex led the way, his steps confident, as if he knew exactly where he wanted to go. I followed, my eyes darting around the shadowy trees. "Where are we going?" I asked, trying to keep my voice steady. He glanced back at me with a small smile. "Just a little spot I saw earlier. It's nice, trust me." I didn't say anything, but the words settled uneasily in my stomach. Trust me. That was something he said a lot, but now it felt heavier, like a demand instead of reassurance. We reached a small clearing bathed in moonlight. The trees parted just enough to reveal the night sky, the stars shimmering like distant promises. Alex stopped and turned to face me, his hands slipping into his jacket pockets. For a moment, I tried to focus on the beauty of the scene, hoping it would ease the tightness in my chest. "This is nice, right?" he said, his voice softer now, almost tender. He stepped closer, and I felt his hands on my arms, warm despite the chill in the air. Just the two of us, no distractions. "Yeah," I said, though my voice came out thin. My heart raced, but not in the way it did when we first started dating. This was different, uneasy, like my body was trying to warn me before my mind could catch up. His grip on my arms tightened slightly, and his tone shifted. "You've been acting weird all weekend, you know that? Like you don't even want to be here." "What?" "No, I started, but he interrupted me. "Don't lie to me, Emily," he said sharply. "I'm trying to make this special, and you're just distant." I took a step back, but his hands followed, his grip firm. Panic rose in my throat. "Alex, you're hurting me." His expression hardened for a split second before softening again, though it felt forced. "I'm not hurting you, you're just too sensitive." His voice dropped lower. "You need to stop pulling away every time I try to get close." I felt the tears welling in my eyes, but I forced myself to stay calm. "Please, can we go back to the fire?" "No," he said firmly, his voice losing its softness entirely. "Not until we work this out." His words felt like a trap, and the air around us seemed to close in. I tried to pull away again, my breath coming in shallow gasps. "Alex, let me go," I said louder this time, but he didn't. Instead, he leaned in closer, his grip tightening further. "Why can't you just... help?" I screamed, cutting him off. My voice echoed through the trees, loud and sharp against the silence. "Someone help me!" Alex froze, his face a mask of shock and anger. "What the hell are you doing?" he hissed, glancing over his shoulder. "Stop yelling!" But I didn't stop. I screamed again, louder this time, until I heard voices in the distance, voices calling my name. Relief surged through me as the sound of footsteps grew closer, accompanied by the glow of flashlights slicing through the dark. Alex released me abruptly, his hands falling to his sides as he took a step back. "Emily," he started, his tone panicked now, "you're making a big deal out of nothing." But I didn't respond. I couldn't. I just stood there, trembling, as Megan and a few others from the group burst into the clearing, their faces a mix of confusion and concern. "What's going on?" Megan demanded, stepping between me and Alex. I opened my mouth to speak, but the words caught in my throat. Instead, I pointed at Alex, the tears finally spilling over. Megan's eyes narrowed as she turned to him. "What did you do?" Alex started to stammer, but Megan didn't wait for an answer. She wrapped her arm around me, guiding me back toward the camp. "It's okay, Emily," she said softly. "You're safe now." Behind us, I could hear Alex protesting, but his voice grew fainter with each step we took. The walk back to camp felt like an eternity. Megan kept her arm around me, her flashlight cutting through the darkness, but the light felt distant and unreal. My legs moved on autopilot, shaky and slow, as though the ground beneath me were made of quicksand. The others trailed behind us, whispering amongst themselves. Their voices felt like static, barely registering over the sound of my own heartbeat. When we reached the bonfire, everything came to a halt. The flames crackled softly, casting shadows across the worried faces gathered around. Someone had pulled out a blanket and draped it over my shoulders, but I didn't feel its warmth. All I could feel was the weight of Alex's hands on my arms, the sharpness of his words replaying in my mind. My throat ached from screaming, but I couldn't stop trembling. Megan knelt in front of me, her face lit by the firelight, her voice calm and steady. "Emily," she said softly, "can you tell us what happened?" I opened my mouth, but the words felt stuck. My chest tightened as the memories surged forward. The clearing, the look in Alex's eyes, the suffocating grip on my arms. Tears spilled over, and I shook my head, unable to speak. Megan reached out and squeezed my hand. "It's okay," she said. "Take your time." From the edge of the group, Alex appeared, his face pale and tense. "This is ridiculous," he snapped. "I didn't do anything wrong. She's just overreacting." Megan stood up abruptly, her glare cutting through him like a blade. "You don't get to talk right now," she said firmly. "You need to leave. Now." "What?" Alex's voice rose in disbelief. "You're seriously kicking me out? Over this?" "Yes," Megan said, her tone unyielding. "We don't tolerate this kind of behavior, Alex. Pack your stuff and go." Alex looked around the circle, his expression shifting from anger to something like desperation. But no one came to his defense. His friends, the ones who had laughed and cheered with him earlier, avoided his gaze. Defeated, he turned and walked toward his cabin, muttering under his breath. I watched his silhouette disappear into the shadows, and for the first time that night, I exhaled. The rest of the group stayed with me by the fire, their presence quiet but reassuring. Megan stayed close, her hand on my shoulder, as if anchoring me to the moment. I didn't say much, there wasn't much to say, but I felt their support in the way they lingered, their concern etched into their faces. The fire burned low, and eventually, one by one, they drifted off to their cabins, leaving me and Megan alone. "You're not alone in this," Megan said softly, her eyes meeting mine. "If you need to talk anytime, I'm here. Okay?" I nodded, swallowing the lump in my throat. "Thank you," I whispered. That night, sleep didn't come easily. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw Alex's face, heard his voice in my ear. I lay awake, staring at the cabin ceiling, the darkness pressing down like a weight. It wasn't until the early hours of the morning that exhaustion finally overtook me, though my dreams were filled with fragmented memories of the clearing. The next day, Alex was gone. His belongings had been packed up, his cabin emptied without fanfare. The group carried on with their plans, hiking, swimming, sharing meals. But the mood was different, quieter, as though everyone was afraid to acknowledge what had happened. Megan stayed by my side, offering quiet reassurances and giving me space when I needed it. When the trip ended, I returned home feeling like I'd left part of myself behind in those woods. The experience lingered, shaping my days in ways I didn't expect. I jumped at loud noises, flinched at casual touches. I avoided crowded spaces, afraid of losing control. Trust, once something I gave freely, now felt like an impossible risk. But slowly, with time and therapy, I began to rebuild. Megan stayed in touch, her support unwavering, and I found strength in her belief that I could move forward. There were days when the memories overwhelmed me, but there were also moments of hope. Quiet walks in the park, laughter with friends, the realization that I had survived. The scars Alex left weren't visible, but they were real. Still, they were a testament to something else, resilience. I wasn't the same person I was before, but I was learning to live again, one step at a time. It was a quiet night. the kind that makes you feel like the world has slowed down. The rain tapped gently against my windshield, a constant rhythm that matched the hum of my car engine. The smell of pizza filled the air, warm and comforting, a sharp contrast to the cold drizzle outside. It was my 6th shift in a row, and I was counting down the minutes until I could clock out. The tips had been decent tonight, and I was already thinking about what I'd do with the extra cash. Maybe save it for a weekend road trip, or finally fix the rattling noise my car made every time I hit a bump. The phone buzzed in its holder, and the GPS lit up with my next delivery. I glanced at the screen, squinting at the address: Willow Lane. I didn't recognize it, but that wasn't unusual. Detroit's suburbs were a patchwork of winding streets and cul-de-sacs, many of them forgotten by time. I sighed and tapped the navigate button, leaning back in my seat as the calm voice of the GPS guided me through the rain-slicked streets. The drive started like any other. The houses were modest but well kept, their porch lights glowing warmly in the darkness. But as I followed the GPS further out, the surroundings began to change. The houses grew more spaced out, their exteriors worn and tired. Broken fences leaned into overgrown yards, and some windows were boarded up. The rain seemed heavier now, or maybe it was just the oppressive silence of the neighborhood. There were no other cars, no signs of life. I double-checked the address. It was right. I told myself that this was just another delivery, probably to some recluse who didn't care about appearances. Still, a knot of unease tightened in my stomach as I turned onto Willow Lane. The house was impossible to miss. It loomed at the end of the street, large but visibly decaying. The paint was peeling in long strips, and the porch sagged as if under the weight of its own history. A single flickering light bulb illuminated the doorway, casting shadows that seemed to dance in the rain. I parked the car and sat for a moment, staring at the house through the blurred glass of my windshield. For a second, I considered driving away, but the thought of explaining an undelivered pizza to my manager made me grab the pizza bag and step out into the rain. The wooden steps of the porch groaned under my weight as I approached the door. I pressed the doorbell, hearing its chime echo faintly inside the house. Nothing, no footsteps, no voices. I knocked, louder this time. "Pizza delivery!" I called out, my voice sounding strange in the stillness. After a long pause, the door creaked open, but no one was there. The interior was dark, the air inside cool and musty. "Hello?" I called, peering into the void. My fingers tightened around the pizza bag. The rain dripped from my jacket onto the porch, the sound unnervingly loud, and then I saw it. I saw it. At the far end of the hallway, barely visible in the faint light, was a figure. Tall, motionless, and indistinct. My heart leapt into my throat as I tried to make sense of what I was seeing. The figure didn't move, didn't speak. It just stood there, its presence heavy and suffocating. I swallowed hard and took a step back, my instincts screaming at me to leave. But before I could turn, the door slammed shut behind me, the sound reverberating through the house. My breath caught as I spun around, my hand fumbling for the doorknob. It wouldn't budge. From behind me came a faint, almost imperceptible sound, a whisper. Low and guttural, it sent a chill racing down my spine. I turned slowly, my pulse pounding in my ears. The figure was gone. The darkness inside the house seemed to grow thicker, as if it were alive, pressing against me from all sides. I stood frozen by the door, gripping the pizza bag so tightly my knuckles turned white. My eyes darted back to where I had seen the figure moments before, but the hallway was empty now, its shadows stretching unnaturally long. The faint whisper I thought I'd heard was gone, replaced by a deafening silence. Even the rain outside seemed muted, as though the house were swallowing the sound. I tried the doorknob again, twisting and pulling with all my strength, but it wouldn't move. It felt as if the house itself was determined to keep me there. My breathing grew shallow, each inhale catching in my throat. "Hello?" I called out, the word trembling as it left my lips. My voice echoed down the hall, coming back to me distorted and hollow. I forced myself to take a step forward, my shoes squeaking against the warped wooden floor. The smell hit me then. Damp, decaying wood mixed with something faintly metallic like rust or blood. My stomach churned, but I pressed on, thinking that maybe someone was playing a cruel joke. Perhaps the owner was lurking nearby, watching me panic, waiting to reveal themselves with a laugh and an apology. But deep down, I knew better. As I moved further into the house, the flickering light from the porch cast my shadow along the walls. Every time it stuttered, the shadows seemed to shift, almost as if they had a life of their own. My fingers hovered over the phone in my pocket, but I didn't dare pull it out. What would I say? That I was trapped in a house with something? The thought of trying to explain made my head spin. I called out again, louder this time. "Whoever's here, this isn't funny. I'm just the pizza guy. Let me out, and I'll leave. I won't even charge you." My attempt at humor fell flat in the oppressive silence. Then, from somewhere deeper in the house, I heard it. A creak, slow and deliberate like a footstep on an old staircase. My breath hitched and I instinctively stepped back, bumping into a small table by the wall. The impact knocked over a lamp, which hit the ground with a dull thud but didn't shatter. The sound seemed impossibly loud, echoing like a gunshot in the stillness. "Okay," I whispered to myself, my voice barely audible. "Stay calm, just get to the car." I turned toward the door, ready to throw my shoulder against it if I had to, but something stopped me. A new sound. Closer this time. It wasn't a footstep. It was a dragging noise, like something heavy being pulled across the floor. My body went rigid, every instinct screaming at me to run, but my feet felt rooted in place. The noise grew louder, coming from the hallway to my left. Slowly, I turned my head, my heart pounding so hard I could feel it in my ears. At first, I didn't see anything. Then, out of the shadows, the figure emerged again, this time clearer in the faint light. It was tall, impossibly tall, with elongated limbs that didn't move quite right. Its head tilted unnaturally to one side, and where a face should have been, there was only darkness like a void. The air around it felt colder, and the metallic smell grew stronger. It didn't move toward me. It didn't have to. The very sight of it sent waves of terror through me, freezing me in place. The figure raised one arm slowly, pointing down the hallway as if beckoning me. Its movement was deliberate, almost taunting. My body finally obeyed my instincts, and I stumbled back, nearly tripping over the fallen lamp. "Stay away!" I shouted, my voice cracking. But it didn't listen. It took a step forward, its foot dragging against the floor with that same sickening sound. I turned and ran, not caring where I was going as long as it was away from that thing. The house seemed to shift around me, the hallways stretching and twisting in ways that didn't make sense. Every time I glanced back, it was there, its hollow face fixed on me, relentless in its pursuit. My breath came in ragged gasps as I ran blindly through the house, the air around me thick and suffocating. Every corner I turned seemed to lead to another hallway, another impossible twist in this labyrinth of decay. The walls themselves felt alive, the peeling wallpaper seeming to ripple in the dim light. Behind me, the dragging sound continued, steady and deliberate, like a predator stalking its prey. I didn't dare look back again. My mind raced, fighting against the primal terror coursing through me. There has to be a way out. There has to be. But every door I tried was locked, the handles cold and unyielding beneath my shaking hands. My legs burned from the effort of running, but the fear was stronger than the pain. I burst into a room at the end of a hallway, slamming the door shut behind me. The room was small and empty except for a single chair in the center, its wood rotted and splintered. A broken window on the far wall let in a faint sliver of moonlight, casting eerie shadows across the floor. I ran to the window, desperate for an escape, but it was too small to climb through. The jagged glass was slick with rain, and the drop outside looked too far to survive. The dragging noise stopped. My ears strained in the silence, waiting, expecting it to burst through the door at any second. Instead, I heard a new sound. Slow, deliberate knocks on the door. 3 of them. Each one sent a jolt of terror through me. I backed away, pressing myself against the wall. My hand fumbled in my pocket for my phone, but when I pulled it out, the screen was dark, lifeless. No amount of button pressing would bring it back to life. The knocks came again, louder this time, the sound reverberating through the room. "Please," I whispered, though I wasn't sure who I was pleading to. "Just let me go." The door creaked open, and I froze. The figure stood there, its head still tilted, the darkness where its face should have been seeming to pulse and shift. It didn't move, but the air around it felt colder, heavier. My body trembled, my mind screaming at me to run, but there was nowhere to go. Then it stepped forward, its long limbs folding and unfolding in ways that defied logic. Each movement was deliberate, almost mechanical. I pressed myself further into the wall as if I could somehow melt into it and disappear. My chest tightened, and I realized I was holding my breath. Suddenly, the figure stopped. It raised one of its long, thin arms and pointed at me, just as it had in the hallway. But this time, its other hand reached toward the window. The glass shattered outward, the shards scattering into the night. A gust of cold air rushed in, and the figure turned its head toward the opening as if beckoning me to jump. I didn't hesitate. I bolted toward the window, the broken glass slicing at my arms and hands as I climbed through. The rain hit my face like icy needles, and I felt myself falling, the wind rushing past me. I hit the ground hard, pain shooting through my legs and side, but I didn't stop. I scrambled to my feet and ran toward the faint glow of my car's headlights in the distance. When I reached the car, I yanked the door open and threw myself inside, locking it behind me. My hands shook so violently that it took 3 tries to get the key into the ignition. The engine roared to life, and I floored the gas pedal, the tires skidding on the wet road as I sped away from the house. In the rearview mirror, the house disappeared into the darkness, but for a split second, I saw it. The figure stood in the middle of the road, watching me, its form illuminated by the fading glow of my taillights. I looked away, focusing on the road ahead, the rain blurring my vision. Even now, I can't explain what I saw in that house. I never went back to Willow Lane, never told my manager or coworkers what happened. They wouldn't believe me anyway. But sometimes on quiet nights when the rain taps against my window, I feel the air grow cold, and in the corner of my room where the shadows are darkest, I swear I see it, watching, waiting. The morning started like any other. The faint hum of fluorescent lights filled the small post office in Fairview, a town where the pace of life was as slow as the rustling of leaves in the occasional breeze. The scent of paper and ink mingled with the faint aroma of coffee from the break room. I had just started my shift, standing behind the counter, sorting through packages while the usual trickle of customers came and went. "Morning, Samantha," Mr. Pot. Grady greeted me as he shuffled in with his usual stack of letters. He was one of the regulars, always polite, always meticulous about weighing each envelope. I nodded with a smile, handing him a receipt after his transaction. It was one of those ordinary days that made this job feel predictable and almost comforting. The kind of day where nothing should go wrong. Around 10 a.m., the usual lull settled in. The sun filtered through the blinds, casting striped shadows across the counters. I sipped my lukewarm coffee, letting the routine settle over me like a blanket. But there was a strange energy in the air, subtle but nagging. Maybe it was just the stillness. Or maybe it was how the phone at the desk seemed unusually loud when it rang. I picked up the receiver, balancing it between my shoulder and ear as I continued sorting mail. "Fairview Post Office, this is Samantha speaking. How can I help you?" "Good morning. Samantha," a male voice said, calm and composed. It wasn't unusual for people to use my name. I wore a name tag, but something about the way he said it made my skin prickle. He spoke slowly, almost deliberately, as if testing my reaction to each word. "I need your support on something important. There's a petition I'd like you to sign." I frowned, pausing mid-motion with a stack of envelopes in hand. "I'm sorry, but we're not allowed to engage in personal matters during work hours. If you want to share more details, you can email us." And "No," he interrupted, his voice sharp but still controlled. "This isn't something you can ignore. It's a matter of justice, Samantha. You believe in doing the right thing, don't you?" There it was again, my name. The way he said it felt invasive, like he knew more about me than he should. I tried to keep my tone professional. "I'm afraid I can't help you with that. If there's nothing else..." "You don't understand," he cut in, his voice growing darker. "This is about you, Samantha. About people like you who think they can stay neutral while the world burns. You'll see. You'll see what happens when you turn your back." A cold wave swept over me. I glanced around the post office. My coworker Emma was busy at the other counter chatting with a customer. The world around me felt normal, but the voice on the line felt like a crack in that normalcy, letting something sinister seep in. "I think you have the wrong person," I said, trying to end the call. But my voice was quieter now, less certain. My fingers gripped the phone tighter as I pressed it to my ear, waiting for his response. "I don't have the wrong person, Samantha," he said, his tone laced with a quiet menace. "I know who you are, I know where you live. I know you drive a blue sedan and park it under that big oak tree outside your apartment." My breath caught in my throat. The envelope slipped from my hands, scattering across the counter. The post office felt too quiet now, the chatter from Emma and her customer fading into the background. How did he know that? "Samantha," the man continued, as if he hadn't just rattled off personal details about my life. "If you don't listen now, I'll have to make you listen. You don't want to know what that looks like." I hung up without thinking, my hands shaking as I slammed the receiver back into its cradle. My heart pounded in my chest, the rhythm deafening. For a moment, I just stood there, staring at the phone as if it might come alive and ring again. The silence that followed was deafening. The phone, now sitting innocuously on the counter, felt like a loaded weapon. I tried to steady my breathing, gripping the edge of the counter as if it might anchor me back to reality. Emma's voice drifted over from the next station, cheerful and oblivious, chatting with a customer about shipping rates. Everything around me looked the same, but nothing felt normal anymore. I bent down to pick up the envelopes I'd dropped, my hands trembling. The man's words replayed in my mind, his tone shifting from calm to menacing in a way that made my skin crawl. How did he know about my car, about the tree outside my apartment? Was it a lucky guess? Or had he been watching me? My thoughts raced, each one darker than the last. I glanced at the clock on the wall. It was 10:16 a.m. The morning was barely half over, and already I wanted to run home, lock the door, and never come back. But I couldn't. Leaving early would mean explaining myself to Emma and my manager, Paul, who was holed up in the back office. And what would I even say? A creepy guy called me and said some stuff about my car? It sounded paranoid, ridiculous even. Still, the unease wouldn't leave me. I straightened up and took a deep breath, trying to shake it off. The mail wasn't going to sort itself, and the line at Emma's counter was growing. I forced a smile and called the next customer over, a middle-aged woman holding a box with fragile written on it in big red letters. "How can I help you?" I asked, my voice steadier than I felt. The next few minutes passed in a blur of small talk and routine tasks. But my nerves were shot. Every time the phone rang, I flinched, half expecting to hear that voice again. Twice I reached for it, only to feel my heart race when it turned out to be a call for Emma or Paul. The ordinary sounds of the post office, keyboards clicking, packages thumping onto scales, the ding of the front door opening, felt too loud, too sharp, like the world was mocking my attempt to act normal. Then, just as I began to think maybe I could push through the day, the phone rang again. The shrill tone cut through the air like a knife, and my stomach dropped. Emma glanced over at me, her brow furrowed slightly. "You okay, Sam? You've been jumpy all morning." I nodded quickly, forcing a laugh that sounded hollow even to my own ears. "Yeah, just didn't sleep well last night." I reached for the phone, my hand hovering over it for a second before I picked it up. "Fairview Post Office, this is Samantha." Silence. "Hello?" I said, my voice rising slightly. The silence stretched on, heavy and oppressive, like the caller was just waiting for me to speak again. "You hung up on me earlier," the man's voice finally said, calm but with an edge that sent a chill down my spine. That wasn't very polite. I opened my mouth, but no words came out. My grip tightened on the phone as I glanced toward Emma. She was busy helping another customer and hadn't noticed the change in my expression. "What do you want?" I finally managed to ask, my voice barely above a whisper. "I want you to listen," he said, his tone dripping with control. "This isn't about what I want. It's about what you need to do. People like you think you can just go through life ignoring the world around you, but you're wrong. Ignoring this will cost you." The line crackled slightly, and then he added, "Do you know what fear sounds like, Samantha? It's quiet at first, like a whisper in the back of your mind, but it grows louder. You'll hear it soon enough." My chest tightened, and I felt like the walls were closing in. "I'm hanging up," I said, forcing the words out. My voice was shaking now, but I didn't care. "No, you're not," he said sharply. "Because if you hang up, you'll regret it." Before I could respond, a loud, sharp sound echoed through the line. It took me a second to process what it was. A gunshot. My body jerked involuntarily. The sound so real it felt like it had happened in the room with me. I dropped the phone, the receiver swinging on its cord and thudding against the counter. My legs felt like they might give out as I stepped back, my heart pounding so hard it hurt. Emma's voice broke through the fog. "Sam? Are you okay?" she asked, her tone concerned as she walked over. I couldn't answer. All I could hear was the echo of the gunshot and the man's voice, calm and cold, warning me that I would regret this. The phone hung from its cord, swinging slightly, as if mocking my inability to control the situation. My chest was tight, each breath feeling harder to draw than the last. Emma's hand landed gently on my shoulder, pulling me back to the moment. "Sam," she said again, her voice steady but laced with concern. "What happened?" I opened my mouth to answer, but nothing came out. The sound of the gunshot still echoed in my ears, as real as if it had been fired right there in the post office. I shook my head, stepping away from the counter. I need a minute," I stammered, brushing past her and heading for the break room. Inside, the fluorescent lights buzzed faintly, and the familiar hum should have been comforting, but it wasn't. I leaned against the counter, my hands gripping the edge as if to keep myself upright. My mind raced, replaying every word the man had said. "You'll regret it." The details about my car, my apartment, the shot. Had it been real? Or was it some twisted psychological game? I couldn't tell. The sound had been so loud, so visceral, but the uncertainty of what it meant gnawed at me. My hands trembled as I fumbled for my phone, unlocking it and scrolling to the number for the local police department. My thumb hovered over the call button. What could I even say? That some stranger on the phone had made vague threats and played a sound effect? Or that it wasn't a sound effect at all? Before I could decide, Emma came in, closing the door behind her. "Sam, you're scaring me," she said softly, leaning against the wall. "What's going on?" I hesitated, then told her everything. The voice, the threats, the gunshot. As I spoke, her face paled, and by the time I finished, she looked as shaken as I felt. That's insane," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "We need to call the cops." I was about to, I admitted, holding up my phone. But even as I said it, a knot of doubt tightened in my stomach. What if they didn't believe me? What if the man wasn't bluffing? If he really knew where I lived, involving the police might make things worse. Emma didn't give me a choice. She grabbed her own phone and started dialing. "If you won't, I will. This guy's a psycho, Sam. He knows too much." The police arrived within 15 minutes, their presence a stark contrast to the quiet monotony of the post office. 2 officers took my statement while another spoke with Paul, our manager. They asked me to describe the voice, the words he'd used, the sound of the gunshot. As I recounted everything, I felt detached, like I was narrating something that had happened to someone else. "We'll trace the call," one of the officers assured me, his tone professional but distant. "Sometimes these are just hoaxes. People looking for attention." I wanted to believe him, but the way his brow furrowed slightly told me he wasn't entirely convinced either. "And if it's not?" I asked, my voice cracking. "If it's not, we'll find him," he said, though the words felt hollow. The rest of the day passed in a haze. The phone rang a few more times, but Emma insisted on answering it, her eyes darting nervously toward me each time. None of the calls were him. By the end of my shift, I was exhausted, both physically and emotionally. Every nerve in my body screamed at me to go straight home and lock the doors, but I couldn't. Home didn't feel safe anymore. Instead, I drove aimlessly for an hour, the radio off, the silence inside the car amplifying the noise in my head. I checked my mirrors constantly, half expecting to see someone following me. When I finally parked under the familiar oak tree outside my apartment, I stayed in the car, staring at the shadowed windows of my building. Every creak of a branch, every rustle of leaves felt like a threat. That night, I barely slept. The gunshot haunted me, replaying every time I closed my eyes. The man's voice was there too, soft and insistent, warning me, mocking me. I checked my locks 3 times before crawling into bed, but it didn't help. I lay awake, staring at the ceiling, waiting for something, anything to happen. In the days that followed, the police called with updates. They had traced the call, but it had come from a burner phone. Impossible to track further. No one reported a shooting in the area that day, But that didn't bring me any comfort. Whether the gunshot was real or fake didn't matter. What mattered was that he had gotten into my head. I returned to work, but things were never the same. Every time the phone rang, I flinched. Every unfamiliar face in the post office made my heart race. I avoided the oak tree by my apartment, parking further down the street, as if that small distance could protect me. The man never called again, but his voice stayed with me, a permanent shadow in the corners of my mind. I don't know if he was playing a game or if I was his game. All I know is that I'll never pick up another phone without hearing his words. You'll regret it.